It began with a letter no one was supposed to read, folded neatly inside an aging envelope, sealed with brittle wax and the faint scent of cedar. It was hidden beneath the floorboards of a house that hadn't known laughter in decades. When it was found, it didn't just reopen old wounds. It split a family down the middle, turning blood into poison and love into quiet, enduring hatred. The letter wasn't written to shock or confess. It was written out of guilt, the kind that festers when truth rots in the dark too long. It carried a name, one that should have never been spoken again. In small towns across America, there are stories that don't make it into the newspapers, stories that are whispered, passed down like warnings. This was one of them. A family that had everything: respect, property, and the illusion of closeness. But behind every Sunday dinner and family photograph was a secret, one that grew in silence until it consumed them all. People who knew them said they were the perfect family. The father, a respected man in town. The mother, quiet, dignified, devoted to keeping up appearances. Their children, polite, educated, promising. But every photograph of them seems to hold something invisible, a tension beneath the smiles, as if someone behind the camera had told them not to breathe. When the truth finally came out, it wasn't through confession, it was through accident. A storm, a collapsed attic beam, and a discovery that turned love into suspicion. What that letter revealed changed the way they looked at one another forever. You might think you know how family secrets work: buried, denied, forgotten. But this one was different. It didn't just destroy relationships, it rewrote who they were. Because what they learned that night wasn't about betrayal, it was about blood, and how easily it lies. And when you trace it back far enough, you realize something chilling. This secret wasn't born from cruelty, it was born from love. The kind of love that blurs the line between right and wrong until both are unrecognizable. This is the story of a family that discovered what it truly means to be bound by blood, and what happens when that bond turns against you. They say every family has a story they'd rather forget. For the Whitlock family, that story began in 1949, on the outskirts of a small town in Virginia, a place where names mattered more than truth, and silence was the price of respectability. The patriarch, Thomas Whitlock, was known as a man of integrity, a banker, churchgoer, and the kind of neighbor who waved from his porch every Sunday morning. His wife, Eleanor, was delicate but composed, the kind of woman who could hold a smile long enough to make you forget she was dying inside. Together, they raised 3 children, Samuel, Caroline, and Henry. From the outside, the Whitlocks were a portrait of American grace. Inside, they were a ticking clock. It started with whispers, faint, uncertain things that crept through the town like wind through cornfields. The whispers said that one of the Whitlock children wasn't Thomas's, that Eleanor had made a mistake during the war years when loneliness turned into comfort. But no one dared ask. In those days, reputation was worth more than truth, and the Whitlocks' reputation was all they had. Still, there was something odd about the children. Neighbors noticed how Samuel and Henry looked nothing alike. How one seemed born of Thomas's stern features, while the other carried something softer, something foreign. And then there was Caroline, the youngest, who often stared into space as if hearing things no one else could. The truth of their bloodline was known only to 2 people, and both swore it would go to the grave. But secrets don't die when people do. They linger like ghosts, waiting for someone curious enough to dig. Years later, when Thomas passed away, the house fell quiet. Eleanor began locking herself in the attic, sorting through old boxes no one was allowed to touch. She stopped attending church, stopped answering the door. Some said grief had driven her mad. Others whispered she was protecting something. And then one night she disappeared. Her car was found at the edge of a ravine, engine still running, driver's door open. No body was ever recovered. For decades her children refused to speak of her. They divided the land, split the inheritance, and pretended she had never existed. But time has a way of peeling back the lies we build to protect ourselves. And when Samuel's daughter, decades later, began restoring the old family home, she found that letter, and that's when everything began again. The letter was written in 1951, 2 years after Thomas Whitlock's death, and only weeks before Eleanor disappeared. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but her handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, deliberate, trembling in certain places, as if she'd stopped and cried before finishing each line. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a confession. She wrote about love, not the kind celebrated in wedding vows or cherished in old age. It was the kind that begins as comfort and ends as ruin. She wrote of a man named Daniel Mercer, a family friend who'd returned from the war broken and changed. He came to their house for supper one winter evening, and from that night on, something unspoken began between them. Eleanor described it as a warmth that filled the silence Thomas left behind. She wrote of guilt, of prayers whispered at night that went unanswered, and of a single night in 1944 that she could never take back. Months later, she realized she was pregnant, and she knew instantly that the child she carried was not her husband's. That child was Henry. The letter revealed how she had spent years watching her sons grow side by side, one bearing his father's cold, disciplined spirit, the other with Daniel's restless eyes and quiet defiance. She loved them both, but her love had divided the family long before anyone knew why. Thomas suspected. The townspeople whispered. The children grew up breathing that tension, never understanding what it was. But the letter didn't end there. Eleanor wrote something no one was prepared for. I thought my sin was mine alone to bear. But the blood I passed on carries its own curse. There is something in it that should not have been mixed. I see it in Henry's eyes, the anger, the dreams, the voices. I fear I have doomed them all. No one knew what she meant by that. The curse, the voices. Some believed it was her guilt talking, others thought it was madness. But those words, doomed them all, would come to define the Whitlocks for generations. When the letter was read aloud decades later, it wasn't Henry who reacted first. It was Samuel. He tore it from his niece's hands and burned half of it before anyone could stop him. But it was too late. They'd all read enough to know the truth. And that truth didn't set them free. It set them against each other. After the letter surfaced, something shifted in the Whitlock family, something irreversible. What had been distant civility turned to open hostility. Old wounds reopened, but this time there was no pretense of healing. Each of them believed the curse Eleanor mentioned was real, and each saw it reflected in someone else. Samuel, now the eldest and self-appointed guardian of the family name, became obsessed with silencing the story. He called it a lie from a weak mind and forbade anyone to speak of it again, but denial only fed suspicion. Henry, the supposed child of another man, began drinking heavily, muttering about things mother saw and the blood that won't rest. His children kept their distance, but they too began to sense something strange in the housey footsteps on empty floors, whispers in the hallway, the scent of cedar and smoke that came without warning. Caroline, who had once been quiet and distant, started keeping a journal. In it, she wrote about dreams, the same dream over and over. A woman standing by the ravine, whispering her name. Each morning, Caroline woke with scratches on her arms and dirt beneath her nails. She told no one. By the time the third generation of Whitlocks grew up, the family had fractured completely. Samuel's descendants lived in the city, changing their names and denying their roots. Henry's side stayed near the land, bitter and poor, clinging to the belief that they were cursed not because of sin, but because of what had been hidden. When the property was finally sold, no one wanted to buy the old house. Local kids dared each other to sneak in, but most didn't stay long. They said they heard someone crying upstairs. Others swore the attic door moved on its own, even when nailed shut. One of Henry's grandsons, a man named Lucas, decided to find out for himself. He spent weeks digging through what remained in the attic: broken photographs, burnt letters, and a single box Eleanor had locked from the inside. Inside it was something worse than anyone imagined: a birth certificate, dated 1944, the father's name scratched out. The child's name not Henry but Samuel. The letter had told only half the truth. Eleanor had lied one last time, to protect someone or perhaps to curse them both. That night, Lucas called his cousin, one of Samuel's descendants. They met at the house the next evening, and from that moment, the Whitlock curse would no longer be rumor, it would become history. They met in the house their grandparents had built with pride, now stripped bare by time. Walls swollen from damp, portraits faded into ghosts. Lucas stood in the living room with the box at his feet. His cousin, Matthew, arrived just after dusk, his headlights cutting through the mist that rolled in from the ravine. Neither spoke for several minutes. They didn't need to. The air carried too much memory. When Lucas finally spoke, his voice trembled. He told Matthew what he'd found: the birth certificate, the handwriting, the date. He said the letter had been wrong. It wasn't Henry who carried Daniel Mercer's blood, it was Samuel. The man who'd spent his life preserving the family's honor was never Thomas Whitlock's son at all. Matthew didn't believe him. Or maybe he didn't want to. He laughed, then shouted, then tore at the certificate with shaking hands. But Lucas only stood there, calm, as if something inside him had already broken long ago. That's when the lights flickered. The old generator kicked once, then went silent. The two men stood in darkness. From upstairs came a sound, faint, deliberate, the creak of floorboards under slow, steady footsteps. They called out, thinking maybe it was an animal or a trick of the wind. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, closer, until they reached the top of the staircase. And then nothing. Matthew shined his flashlight up the stairs. Dust swirled like ash in the beam. There was no one there. But both men said later they saw the same thing. The faint outline of a woman standing in the shadows, her head tilted, her eyes hollow with sorrow. They ran. Neither returned for days. But the house, as it always did, waited. Word spread quickly among the few who still remembered the Whitlocks. Some said the curse had finally taken shape, that Eleanor's guilt had bound her spirit to that house, protecting the secret she'd tried to bury. Others said it was all madness, that Lucas and Matthew had been driven by years of family lies and shame. But something else began happening. Both men started having the same dream. A voice whispering from the ravine, calling them by name. A voice that said, it wasn't about sin. It was about blood. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you keep digging, or would you let the dead keep their secrets? Because for Lucas and Matthew, there was no turning back. They had one more truth to uncover. The truth Eleanor had taken to her grave. Lucas couldn't let it rest. A week after that night, he returned to the Whitlock property alone. He said he needed to finish what she started. Locals warned him not to go. Said the ravine swallowed secrets. Said the ground there never stayed still. But obsession has a way of sounding like purpose to those who've lost too much. He parked the truck near the edge of the woods and hiked toward the ravine, guided only by moonlight and memory. The air was heavy, the way it gets before a storm, still electric listening. When he reached the spot where Eleanor's car had been found 70 years earlier, he saw something glinting beneath the soil, rusted metal, tangled roots, and the faint outline of what looked like a cross. He dug with his hands until the dirt turned black beneath his nails. Then, just as his strength began to fade, he found what she'd buried. Not bones, not a diary, but a small tin box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were photographs, blurred, overexposed, of Eleanor holding a child. The child was neither Samuel nor Henry, and scrawled on the back of each photo, in the same shaking hand as her letter, were 5 words. He was never meant to live. Lucas froze. He counted again. 3 children were known, but these photographs showed a 4th. A baby that had never been recorded, never spoken of, and apparently never survived. The next morning, Matthew received a voicemail. It was from Lucas, but his voice was strange, distant, almost hollow. He said he'd found something the family needed to see. But when Matthew arrived at the ravine hours later, all he found was Lucas's truck door open, headlights still on. No sign of him. Only the tin box resting on the hood and one last photograph laid beside it. One Matthew swore hadn't been there before. It was a picture of Eleanor again, standing by the ravine, her face half turned toward the camera. And behind her, barely visible in the tree line, was the figure of a child. Matthew burned the box that night. He told no one what else he saw. But neighbors reported hearing someone calling his name from the woods long after midnight. A voice that sounded like Lucas, or something using his voice. The Whitlock story should have ended there. But curses don't end when the last living person dies. They end when the truth is finally spoken aloud. And this truth was still waiting. Months passed before anyone spoke of the Whitlocks again. The house sat empty, watching over the ravine like a monument to regret. Rain bled through its roof, wind whistled through its halls, and sometimes, on quiet nights, a single light would flicker in the attic. Though no power ran to the property anymore, Matthew tried to move on. He sold what little land remained, changed his number, and moved 3 states away. But even distance couldn't silence the past. He began seeing things, fleeting, impossible things, in reflections, in the corner of his vision. A woman's outline near the water's edge. The sound of a baby crying in rooms that weren't there. He told himself it was guilt, that it was just the family's madness creeping into his own blood. But one night, unable to sleep, he pulled out what he'd sworn he destroyed, the last unburned photograph, the one showing Eleanor and the child. He noticed something he hadn't before. Behind her, carved faintly into the tree line, were initials, T.W., Thomas Whitlock. It didn't make sense. Thomas had been buried in town, far from the ravine, yet the markings were clear, carved deep into the wood as if by a man desperate to be remembered, or to warn someone. Matthew drove back to Virginia, to the house, to the ravine. He said it would be the last time. The road was overgrown now, the air colder than it should have been for summer. When he reached the clearing, he found the trees cut open by time, and there it was, faint but visible under the moss. T.W. 1944. Beneath it, the soil looked freshly disturbed. He dug with his hands, expecting nothing, until he felt something solid. A small wooden box wrapped in cloth identical to the one Lucas had found. Inside was a note, only a few words, written in Thomas's unmistakable script. He was not mine, but neither was she. It was then that Matthew understood. Eleanor's sin hadn't begun with Daniel Mercer. It had begun before the war, before her marriage. The bloodline had been fractured long before she ever realized it. Thomas had known. He had hidden it, and what she thought was her punishment, the voices, the curse, was really just the echo of generations deceiving themselves into believing they were pure. That night, the wind picked up through the trees, carrying a single whisper down the ravine. It ends when you tell the truth. But the truth no longer belonged to the living.